Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is the Week 6 lecture for early American literature. Today, I have a fair amount. I want to discuss Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Judith Sargent Murray, but I want to start today with Thomas Paine. And he's a figure you may know. He was an important writer, political thinker, and philosopher during the American Revolutionary period. Today, we will discuss, or I will discuss, Common Sense, a pamphlet published in 1776. And one of the things that I want to do here at the beginning is actually just talk about what that means for a text to be a pamphlet, because one of the ideas that I have returned to often, and one of the ideas that I've asked you to think about are just these, or the idea itself is just the different sorts of texts that I've asked you to read this semester, because we haven't read what you might often see or expect in a literature course. We haven't just read, for example, short fiction and poetry. We will read a bit of poetry before the semester ends, but we've also read captivity narratives, we've read sermons, we've read bits of mythology, we've read these texts that if we wanted to use a word like complete, we would do so in a rather dubious way because they seem incomplete, or there's something complicated about the construction of the text when thinking about just the text itself or the author or authors that produced and created those texts. And the pamphlet is an interesting genre of writing, especially during this period, the late 18th and early 19th century, because the pamphlet, it's meant to be more of a bit of rhetoric, which is to say it's meant to perhaps incite particular sorts of feelings, perhaps strong feelings. In that way, the pamphlet, it has this perhaps effect of not necessarily delving as deep as we might expect from a formal essay or even a book, like a bit of nonfiction political philosophy. But one of the things that I do want to at least talk about is how, even though Paine, he doesn't, again, delve into the sorts of detail we would want if we wanted to, for example, build a kind of political infrastructure with his ideas, I think he does give us, or at least he gestures toward, some of the sorts of things, some of the characteristics of what a country should be and what a democracy should be. I think he still gives us some of that, and that's principally what I want to talk about today. But I would feel remiss if I didn't also just highlight again how big Paine can get sometimes, which is to say he, for a lack of a better phrase, is not pulling punches. And in that way, the pamphlet, it's quite a unique genre of writing, because Paine, he doesn't, and I think just the genre itself is indicative of this, he doesn't seem to want to offer just this sober analysis of a situation. He again wants to incite particular sorts of feelings. But I think one of the places that I want to start because I mentioned a moment ago that I think we could still extract some ideas out of this pamphlet that might give us a sense of what perhaps Paine's political preferences are when, again, thinking about what a country should be, what its government should look like. Paine, he's certainly more of a universalist, and I'll talk about what that means later. And I think this is quite clear, he also possesses this aggression toward Great Britain, and by extension, he seems to argue that America needs independence from Great Britain to fully realize itself, if we wanted to use that kind of affirmative language that we would today. He argues, for example, on 684, that America's affiliation with Great Britain it's not universal, but it's more of this forced union in some way. But I also, and this is connected to what I just said, but I think it's important to also acknowledge if we wanted to, again, use contemporary language, I think it's important to acknowledge Paine's isolationism. But again, this is not necessarily within the country itself. This is in relation to, as he says on 686, Europe, Great Britain. He seems to think and he wants to argue that America should be this independent place unto itself, perhaps potentially isolated from these other hubs or sources of power that for a figure like Paine, he seems to think have just become perhaps irredeemably corrupted by their systems of government. So I think early in the text, if we wanted to go to the text itself, we get a sense of what earlier I described as this kind of universalism. And this is on page 683. So this is the end of that first, this is the beginning of the second full paragraph. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. Many circumstances have and will arise which are not local but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected, and in the event of which their affections are interested. So he even uses, and this is in the introduction, he even uses a word like universal here, but I want to spend a moment to talk about what I think he means by this and how it's distinct from particularist ways of thinking. And I think what he's ultimately thinking about here is how we are to understand ourselves in relation to a larger collective body. Because I think for someone like Paine, he might argue that you really only start to feel, understand, and experience a sense of what we would today perhaps call individuality once you've fully and unapologetically and thoroughly just relinquished yourself to this collective body. If you try to maintain this position perpetually outside, I think maybe for someone like Paine and for thinkers of this time, you're not really independent. And again, I'll try to explain what I mean by this as we just work through this text. But common sense is quite short, and if you were to read, for example, Paine's 1790 text, Rights of Man, I think you have a clearer sense of this, because for someone like Paine, and here Paine, he was extremely influenced by the French Revolution, and some of the things he argues in Rights of Man is the need or the necessity for these, today, what we would call large government programs to address income inequality. Again, this is language we would use today to address poverty and hunger. He seems to want to argue and suggest, and again, I think you can see some of the seeds of that here in Common Sense. He wants to argue and suggest that for us to really be free, we need to again embrace this collective way of thinking. And in that way, it's interesting how you can see, and again, I wouldn't want to suggest that he's borrowing exclusively from a figure like Winthrop, but if you think about how I've staggered the reading for this semester, that's certainly something that Winthrop seemed to argue as well. But for Winthrop, it was about this exclusive and exclusionary Christian community. You almost see someone like Paine trying to incorporate that into this secular realm or this secular area when thinking about, for example, what a government should look like and what its responsibilities are to its people and what its people's responsibilities are to its government. But later on 683, I wanted to read a couple of paragraphs because I think this, again, helps to perhaps explain what he means when he speaks about or writes about the need for again, the universal. In the following pages, I offer nothing more than simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense, and have no other preliminaries to settle with the reader than that he will divest himself of prejudice and prepossession and suffer his reason and his feelings to determine for themselves, that he will put on, or rather that he will not put off, the true character of a man and generously enlarge his views beyond the present day. Volumes have been written on the subject of the struggle between England and America. Men of all ranks have embarked in the controversy from different motives and with various designs, but all have been ineffectual, and the period of debate is closed. Arms, as the last resource, decide the contest. The appeal was the choice of the king, and the continent has accepted the challenge. It hath been reported of the late Mr. Pelham, who, though an able minister, was not without his faults, that on his being attacked in the House of Commons on the score that his measures were only of a temporary kind, replied, "They will last my time." Should a thought so fatal and unmanly possess the colonies in the present contest, the name of ancestors will be remembered by future generations with detestation. And I'll continue to the next page, 684. The sun never shines on a cause of greater worth. 'Tis not the affair of a city, a country, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. This not the concern of a day, a year, or an age. Posterity are virtually involved in the contest and will be more or less affected even to the end of time by the proceedings now. So I think that's where I'll stop. And in particular, this language on 684, I think, is extremely important. And perhaps this isn't because he wants to offer some modifications. So this is not a fight for the whole world. He uses language like continent, 1/8 of the habitable globe, but he is getting a lot closer, perhaps, than, by his estimation, many before him have, because he's also not just including every individual man, woman, child of the day, but he even makes reference to the future. He speaks about posterity, which is to say those that come after us. So you can see for someone like Paine here, and I think this is part of, again, I mentioned the pamphlet is more than anything, a text that's just brimming with this kind of impassioned rhetoric. I think this is one of the moments where you see it, because think about when political figures today talk about the need for action, they often talk about the future. Children, in particular, symbolize the future in interesting ways. And here, Paine does something quite similar. But I think part of how this helps us understand what he means when he writes about, or when he references the universal, it's this sense that this is not a fight for one of us. This is not a fight for part of us. This is a fight for all of us, even if perhaps we would want him to include everyone. Perhaps even if Paine wanted to suggest this is for England too, right? This fight, it's not just our fight, but it's this collective, universal human fight. And another thing that I would encourage you to think about, and this is also on 684, is what do you make of his justifications for this break from Great Britain? And this is, if you look, it's near the middle of the page. It's the paragraph that begins with, "I have heard it asserted by some that as America has flourished under her former connection with Great Britain, the same connection is necessary towards her future happiness and will always have the same effect. Nothing can be more fallacious than this kind of argument. We may, as well, assert that because a child has thrived upon milk, that it is never to have meat, or that the first 20 years of our lives is to become a precedent for the next 20. Some interesting examples, some interesting analogies here. I think in particular, this reference to children and milk, because just think about the implications of this example or the implications of this analogy. It seems to suggest that this union or this connection between America and Great Britain, it's not a connection between equal forces. It's really a connection between a mother and a nursing child. And if you just think about, for example, how much dependency a nursing child has in relation to his, her, or their mother, then this really casts this, quote, connection in a fundamentally different light, because it's not, again, a connection of equals. It's a connection between someone or something, a country in this case, that's independent, and a fledgling country that's just wildly and seemingly irrevocably dependent. So I think the point Paine wants to make here is this is not a connection between equals. This is a connection. This is a kind of chronic dependent relationship that we have, and you just can't flourish under those conditions. I would love to know what you think about just that analogy or that justification. Once again, if we wanted to say a little more about what Paine describes as the universal, perhaps, underpinnings of this revolution, on page 685, quote, "We claim brotherhood with every European Christian and triumph in the generosity of the sentiment." Again, trying to forge these larger universal connections. But what I think is interesting, and this is why I think even though Paine thinks he's making these universal or universalist gestures, he's regrettably excluding some people, or there are these exclusionary acts. Notice, for example, this ignoring of Native Americans that happens later in the text. This is on pages 686 and 687. "The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Even the distance at which the Almighty hath placed England and America is a strong and natural proof that the authority of the one over the other was never the design of heaven. The time likewise which the continent was discovered adds weight to the argument, and the manner in which it was peopled increases the force of it. The Reformation was preceded by the discovery of America, as if the Almighty graciously meant to open a sanctuary to the persecuted in future years, when home should afford neither friendship nor safety." And I'll talk about this reference to nature when I talk about, in particular, Jefferson and Judith Sargent Murray, because using nature as a kind of justification for either how the world works or just, again, imagining that nature was preordained to work in certain ways is a bit complicated. But it's this language on 687, the discovery of America. Because think about how that performs a kind of erasure, which is to say, it's excluding someone, right? Paine, at least here in common sense, seems to suggest that America was this, at least I think this is the implication, and you can disagree with me. I would love to hear it if you do, but I think this is the implication, that America was this unpopulated continent, and it was discovered by these settlers who were, by Paine's estimation, the children of this religious persecution, and that for someone like Paine does the work or has the effect of justifying this separation, this rebellion from Great Britain. But my point, though, and I think you're probably getting it, my point, though, is the way he frames this completely ignores and completely erases the presence of Native Americans on this continent. And regrettably, because of that, Paine's universalism is not, regrettably, actual universalism. Again, he's getting a lot closer, perhaps, than, and this is something we could talk about more, perhaps he's getting a lot closer than what he sees and understands in Great Britain, the cultural and political system there. But this is still an exclusionary act, I suppose, is my point. But I do want to jump back a page to 686 because, again, I think Paine offers us this impression of what he wants America to be and look like. Again, it's not, he doesn't explicate his points and his ideas in the kind of detail that you might see or find in something like Rights of Man, but it's giving us a sense, it's giving us an indication. This is on 686, and it's basically the middle of the page. Besides, what we have we to do with settling the world at defiance. Our plan is commerce, and that, well attended to, will secure us the peace and friendship of all Europe, because it is the interest of all Europe to have America a free port. Her trade will always be a protection, and her barrenness of gold and silver secure her from invaders. I challenge the warmest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. If you were, perhaps earlier, a little afraid of a figure like Thomas Paine, because I spoke about how he thinks there should be these robust government mechanisms to address hunger, poverty, inequality, etc. Pay attention to what he says here. This is a capitalist model, like so many people want today, where there's our success or our failure is determined by not this tenuous connection to this mothering Great Britain, but our success or our failure is really market driven. Can we trade? Can we export and import effectively? So I think in that way, what we're seeing is according to Paine at least, a country that is this capitalist hub or harbor. So again, perhaps not explored and not explained in the kind of detail we would want, because, hey, if you're reading this, you might think, well, I would like to know what, in a particular way or in a particular sense, what you're thinking about. But as just a piece of rhetoric, I think it has this effect, again, of casting America, by contrast to a country like Great Britain, casting America as this site of trade and innovation and market solutions to problems. Again, if we wanted to use contemporary language, that seems to be what he's gesturing towards with language like this. So I think that's all I want to say about Paine. I find Thomas Paine endlessly entertaining as a writer and a thinker, and I always think I'm not necessarily doing him justice by asking you to read so little of him. But if you're interested in Thomas Paine, if you liked common sense, I would strongly encourage you to read Rights of Man. Again, it was published in 1790, approximately 14 years after Common Sense. It's a much longer text, and if you're interested in his ideas, I think you get a clearer sense of those ideas in Rights of Man. But now for a moment, I want to transition to Thomas Jefferson. I don't know if I need to say anything about who Thomas Jefferson is. He's the guy, you know him. He's the guy who antagonizes Hamilton in that musical Hamilton. I don't know if all of you have watched it. I've only watched part of it, but I've heard good things. My wife really likes it. So, okay, Thomas Jefferson, Notes on the State of Virginia, his only published book. And it's the bits that I asked you to read. And what I want to talk about in particular are those bits about the differences between white people and black people, because it's awful and disgusting and it's the worst. And I won't read particular passages because, again, I think it's just awful and distasteful. But what I do want to say, and I want to be careful as I talk about this, because I think there's a way of reading what I'm about to say as a kind of justification, and it's under no circumstances that this was, and I mentioned this just a moment ago with someone like Thomas Paine, thinking about, well, what kind of a world has nature produced? And for someone like Thomas Jefferson, these ideas about the differences between white and black people was a projection of the science of the time, or scientific consensus, natural science. If you want a practical example, think about phrenology, for example. And I would encourage you definitely know what this is, even if you've never heard that phrase. It's this just cockamamie bit of science that suggests you can understand someone's mental and intellectual capacity by just measuring the size of their head and skull, right? So phrenology was a branch of science, and I would use air quotes because it's not science, but it was a way of doing scientific work at the time that tried to explain the differences between, here in this context, white people and black people. And I don't think I need to say this, but I will. It is a deeply racist way of understanding just differences between human beings. But for someone like Jefferson, it's a convenient way to understand this kind of natural hierarchy. And I think that's an important concept to think about as well. Well, what has nature ordained as right and natural? Well, for someone like Jefferson, considering what he writes in Notes on the State of Virginia, there are these clear distinctions, these unmistakable distinctions between white people and black people. And again, he is clearly constructing a hierarchy. And you might think, because if you wanted to understand this text in relation to or in context with some of the other bits of writing that we associate with Thomas Jefferson, such as the Declaration of Independence, created in 1776, you might think, well, okay, so he probably wrote this before the Declaration of Independence, right? Because we want to imagine that some of the more lofty and aspirational ideals in the Declaration of Independence, it's something Jefferson had to learn. He almost had to unlearn some of the awful racial nonsense and racist nonsense that we see in Notes on the State of Virginia. But the irony here, the deep irony here, is Notes on the State of Virginia was written in 1785. So it was written approximately a decade after the Declaration of Independence, which, again, when you just hear that, it doesn't necessarily square with the Jefferson we're often taught about. And this is something, if you go, for example, to Monticello, this is something over the last couple of years and the last couple of decades that his estate has attempted to rectify some of these inconsistencies in the depiction of a figure like Thomas Jefferson. But one of the things in particular that I want to talk about today regarding this text, because we don't get the whole thing, right? We're only getting parts of Notes on the State of Virginia. The textbook omits what's called Query 28. And if I haven't said so, and I think this is important as well, it is a book, but it's a book that's a collection of answers to a series of questions or queries asked by a French diplomat who was just curious about this fledgling country called the United States. And Jefferson responded to this diplomat, and later those responses or those answers became Notes on the State of Virginia. But his answer to Query 28, called Manners, I think is important. I think it's important for a couple of reasons, and I provide this resource on D2L, so I would encourage you to go read it, but I'll read it here as well, because this reveals, even within the text itself, even within Notes on the State of Virginia, this odd contradiction, because you would think after reading some of that awful, racist, natural science nonsense from earlier that Jefferson, we as readers have a clear and unambiguous sense of what Jefferson thought, and perhaps even that he had a clear and unambiguous sense of what he thought. But I'll just read Query 28 because I think it's important. So follow along with me if you can. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever, that considering numbers, nature, and natural means only a revolution of the wheel of fortune and exchange of situation is among possible events, that it may become probable by supernatural interference. The Almighty has no attribute which can take side with us in such a contest. But it is impossible to be temperate and to pursue this subject through the various considerations of policy, of morals, of history, natural and civil. We must be contented to hope they will force their way into every one's mind. I think a change already perceptible since the origin of the present revolution. The spirit of the master is abating, that of the slave rising from the dust, his condition mollifying, the way, I hope, preparing, under the auspices of heaven, for a total emancipation, and that this is disposed, in the order of events, to be with the consent of the masters, rather than by their extirpation. So I'll unpack what Jefferson means here. I think the bit at the beginning is particularly important because what Jefferson ultimately suggests is if there is a revolution, and here he's not speaking about this revolution between America and Great Britain, he's speaking specifically about a revolution between slaves and their masters. He says, unambiguously, if that happens, God will not support us. And by us, of course, he means this white slave-holding class. He says, God will support them. God is on their side. And think about what that does. And think about how that's an acknowledgement of the sins, not just of slavery itself, but the sins of those who enslaved people of color in America. Jefferson clearly has some awareness of the mistakes he's made, the mistakes he continues to make as he writes this, and the mistakes that this slave-holding class, and by extension, his country, makes, again, as he writes this, or as he wrote this. And what I always ask and encourage my students to think is, why would the book omit this? What effect does that have? Because I think it has the effect of rendering Jefferson a singularly and unambiguously unrepentant figure. And of course, saying that is not to justify what he writes earlier in Notes on the State of Virginia. It's just to show that even a textbook, and this is something I really like to talk about a lot because I think it complements some of the things we've talked about earlier in the semester about how texts are constructed. We often think of the textbook as, well, something that is ideologically neutral, right? There's no way these editors have a ideological program. It's just a textbook. But even in the crafting of this textbook, even in the way they choose to include some information and omit other pieces of information, it has this way of encouraging us as readers to arrive at certain conclusions. And I just like to mention it. And I think this often works better in a traditional classroom environment where students can respond to just hearing this and learning about this. Maybe you've read Notes on the State of Virginia, so you already knew this. But I suppose my quick and dirty point is even something like a textbook is something you should possess some skepticism of it. Anyway, okay. I think I want to move on now and say something quickly about Judith Sargent Murray. Okay, so Judith Sargent Murray, even though she didn't have this language at the time, it's quite clear that she's a feminist. She wrote about the importance of equality, and more specifically, the independence or the necessity of the independence of the female mind. And this is something I always like to mention to my students. She was a professional writer in a time when women were not only assumed to be inferior to men, but obviously because of that, it was a time where there just really weren't any professional female writers. And I think what we see in On the Equality of the Sexes, her emphasis on education and the necessity of education, and even how she's so incredibly clever and witty. She uses these very precise arguments about nature and how nature has created and constructed the world in this very particular way. She uses those kinds of arguments and really just turns them on their head to support, again, today what we would call this feminist project. And I wanted to start with again, just maybe identifying some of these moments where we can see how witty and how funny and engaging she is as a writer. This is on page 773. Another instance of our creative powers is our talent for slander. How ingenious are we at inventive slander? What a formidable story can we, in a moment, fabricate merely from the force of a prolific imagination? How many reputations in the fertile brain of a female have been utterly despoiled? So here, again, this tone, you can tell there's this layer of sarcasm, there's clear wit here, but notice how her point, and I think any good satire, and this is something you see with a writer like Dorothy Parker, a wonderful feminist comedic writer and poet from the early 20th century, There's, of course, this bit of humor, this joke, but what ultimately underpins it, or perhaps what emerges out of it, is this larger point she wants to make about what she describes as the female mind or the female intellect. And again, while all of this might sound quite silly to us reading it today in the 21st century, I think it's important to understand that what Murray writes about here is the sort of thing that was not just commonly assumed to be correct. In fact, the complete opposite was commonly assumed to be correct. And it wasn't just a set of beliefs that people just held, because it's something that I think you can see this with Jefferson in particular. Science was producing, or at the time, what they called science, natural science, was producing literature to support and validate these positions and these perspectives. And what I think is interesting, and she does this later on 773, is how she basically rebounds a lot of these arguments about, again, these kinds of hierarchies, whether they're racial hierarchies, gender and sexual hierarchies. She rebounds them back on and to the speakers themselves, and really implicates them in the current state of affairs. So this is what she writes at the bottom of 773. We can only reason from what we know. And if an opportunity of acquiring knowledge hath been denied us, the inferiority of our sex cannot fairly be deduced from thence. And basically what she means is, and I think this is important because I think this is one of the more substantive critiques of not just the science of the time, but I think it's the kind of question that we should always keep in mind when attempting to understand knowledge that humanity produces. And it might sound something like this. What sorts of presuppositions have you, whomever you are, this nebulous individual who produces what, again, they would call science, what sorts of assumptions and presuppositions have you brought to that investigation and that exploration? Because I think often those kinds of assumptions are hidden, or they're just simply not acknowledged. And I think a wonderful example that is far more contemporary is and maybe you've heard of this book before, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And if you're not familiar with it, I would encourage you to do a bit of research about it, because it's fascinating in its ineptitude. But it's this book that at times basically argues, well, men are far more interested in retreating into their little caves and their little areas of the home after work. They're not as communicative as women. And of course, women, by contrast, they're quite talkative, they're quite chatty, they want to communicate. And that's part of how the author of this book justifies these differences between men and women. And the author, if I didn't mention this before, the author is John Gray, and this book was first published in 1992. But I think one of the assumptions that he misses, or one of the assumptions that he ignores, is that he was, and he is a psychologist, he's still alive, but at the time he was doing psychology and working with patients who lived and existed in a world where women still predominantly remained at home and men worked outside of the home. And if you just gain that out a bit, you start to see why he would come to the conclusions he came to. Instead of those being essentially true about men and women, perhaps they're better explained by environment and conditions. So men, for example, again, as Gray wrote this, the sorts of patients he saw, men worked predominantly outside of the home. They spent most of their day in extremely social situations and environments. And if you're someone who spends all day in an extremely social environment or even a moderately social environment, you may want to just go home and just sit quietly for a bit and not really talk to anyone. And that has less to do with sex, gender, and biology, and far more to do with just conditions and environments and the world as we've built it. And women, by contrast, because they were predominantly in the home, they had, by comparison, very little social interaction. So it would certainly explain why, when they had someone to interact with, they would want to interact with them. Again, that had far, far less to do, in fact, nothing to do with gender, sex, and biology, and far, far more to do with just how we've built and constructed this world. And I think that's precisely the kind of point that Judith Sargent Murray is trying to get at here. How you say that women are intellectually inferior, but you've created the conditions for them to be intellectually inferior. So how could they be anything but, which we could interrogate that as well. But I think the point Murray wants to get at is how these kinds of essentialist arguments about who and what men and women in a traditional heteropatriarchal society, what men and women ultimately are, is not determined so much by their biology. These are not essentialist claims, but by the culture that produces them and the rules that dictate and determine that culture and how it creates this kind of circle or this feedback loop. And she has these additional quotes as well, which support this larger point about the need for education. This is on 774. How is the one exalted and the other depressed? By the contrary modes of education which are adopted. The one is taught to aspire, and the other is early confined and limited. But one of the final things I wanted to talk about with Murray, again, is how she so deftly addresses this question of nature and these kinds of conclusions that natural science arrives at, and really just turns them on their head. And this is on 775 and 776. Besides, were we to grant that animal strength proved anything, taking into consideration the accustomed impartiality of nature, we should be induced to imagine that she had invested the female mind with superior strength as an equivalent for the bodily powers of man. But waiving this, however palpable advantage, for equality only, we wish to contend. So I think what she means here, and I think here she's really interrogating this notion that men and women complement one another. You've probably heard this sort of thing before. And she uses that argument to, in effect, justify her position regarding female intelligence. And what she basically says is, well, if we can imagine, or if we accept this premise that nature has created some of us differently from others, and nature constantly strives for, or it creates these conditions for complementarism, isn't it reasonable to assume that if men have these big, strong, physically imposing bodies, that women, again, as a complementary gesture, because according to Murray, of course, women do not have bodies that are as physically strong as men. Well, what must their strength be? Well, it must be intellectual strength. And again, I think we can even see or detect some of her humor and some of her wit here, because the implication is basically, well, if I got this right, aren't men just these big, brutish, unthinking things? And women are these thoughtful, intelligent, cerebral things? And so even just seeing how, again, she takes these kinds of arguments about nature seriously, but then exposes the hole or the flaw in them. And I think you see her do this as well. And this is the last thing I'll say in her rewriting of the Adam and Eve narrative, because what she basically suggests is, well, all women really wanted was knowledge. And this is on page 778. It doth not appear that she was governed by any one sensual appetite, but merely by a desire of adorning her mind. So notice how she, again, flips this conventional narrative and argues that it wasn't about sex and it wasn't about sensuality. It was just about cultivating the mind, cultivating the intellect. And by extension, and notice what she says, and this is at the top of 779, blush, ye vaunters of fortitude, ye boasters of resolution, ye haughty lords of the creation, blush when you remember that he, and here she's writing about Adam, he was influenced by no other motive than a bare, pusillanimous attachment to a woman. By sentiments so exquisitely soft that all of his sons have from that period, when they have designed to degrade them, described as highly feminine. So notice again this inversion, because what Murray basically argues here is, no, this narrative about Adam and Eve, to this point, we've gotten it all wrong. All women really wanted, all Eve really wanted, was the cultivation of her mind. She just wanted education. But what Adam wanted, and this word pusillanimous, it's a word we don't necessarily use that often today, but it just means to show a lack of courage or to be timid. But all Adam really wanted was to remain connected to Eve. And the way, again, she inverts these stereotypes about men and women, because her characterization of Eve makes her sound, if we wanted to just indulge in these kinds of caricatures, it sounds distinctly masculine. Whereas Adam, again, if we wanted to indulge these stereotypes, his behavior sounds distinctly feminine. So I think, again, you can see, and my God, just imagine this was written in 1790. Someone writing this in 1790, there's some moxie there, I suppose. But okay, I have spoken far longer than I wanted, but I think that's where I will stop. Again, these are three interesting writers, in particular Payne and Murray. I think, again, all of you probably know Jefferson, but I would encourage you to return to these texts because I think there's a lot here to mine if you wanted to write an essay. But until we speak again, this is Colin Cox, and this is Early American Literature.